Julian's problem was never money. That was the illusion he clung to. He believed that because he understood numbers, controlled accounts, and anticipated outcomes, he could always calculate his way out of discomfort. Money, to Julian, wasn't about security. It was about insulation. A buffer between cause and consequence. What he failed to understand was that money doesn't protect you once trust has thinned. It only reveals how exposed you really are. The first financial consequence arrived quietly. No dramatic freeze. No alarming notification. Just a request. Julian's attorney asked for a reconciliation of recent transfers, routine, phrased neutrally, but unmistakable in implication. Documentation. Dates. Purpose. Julian stared at the email longer than necessary. "I've already explained this," he said later that evening, pacing the apartment. "They're just internal movements." "Then it should be easy to explain again," I replied. He stopped pacing. "You're enjoying this," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm not preventing it." That distinction mattered. Julian had spent years assuming that anything not actively opposed was quietly endorsed. He hadn't planned for neutrality to become resistance. By midweek, the requests multiplied. Clarification of joint expenditures. Explanation of overlapping timelines. Verification of disclosures made before and after separation discussions. Nothing accusatory. Nothing hostile. Just thorough. Thoroughness unsettles people who rely on speed. Julian tried to reassert authority the way he always had, through decisiveness. "We should consolidate accounts," he said one morning, sliding a document across the table. "It'll simplify everything." I looked at it calmly. Consolidation would complicate review. He frowned. "It's standard." "So is transparency," I replied. The document stayed where it was. Julian didn't push it further. That, more than anything, told me how much ground he'd already lost. Martha called me later that day. "He's trying to reduce visibility," she said. "By simplifying?" I replied. "Yes," she said. "Which is rarely simple." "What does that mean for timing?" I asked. "It slows him down," she replied. "And slows benefit you." Slow again. The word followed me now, steady and reassuring. Julian's tone changed after that. He stopped framing things as mutual decisions and started presenting them as problems. "This is getting expensive," he said one evening. "Lawyers. Reviews. Delays." "It's getting accurate," I replied. "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." He began to talk about compromise. Not in emotional terms. Financial ones. "We could settle this quickly," he said. "Avoid unnecessary scrutiny." Scrutiny. There it was. Julian wasn't afraid of loss. He was afraid of being examined. "What would settlement look like?" I asked. He hesitated, then outlined terms that favored speed over equity. Closure over clarity. I listened without interrupting. Then I said, "Those terms assume trust." His jaw tightened. "We were married," he said. "That should count for something." "It did," I replied. "It just doesn't count for everything." That night, Marissa sent me a message I hadn't expected. He asked me to sign something. I stared at the screen. "What kind of something?" I typed. "An agreement," she replied. "About privacy." Privacy. Julian was trying to contain fallout. "Did you sign it?" I asked. There was a pause. "No." That single word mattered. I typed carefully. That was wise. She didn't respond immediately. Then, he says it's to protect everyone. Protect everyone. Julian's favorite justification. I replied. Protection that only flows one way isn't protection. The next day, Julian called me unexpectedly. I need you to stop interfering, he said. I'm not interfering, I replied. I'm participating. That's not what it feels like, he snapped. That's because you're not used to it, I said calmly. He went quiet. Then, softer, this is affecting my liquidity. Liquidity. He was counting now. That's something to discuss with your attorney, I replied. He hung up without another word. The mediation reconvened the following week. The tone was different this time. More formal. Less patient. The mediator asked Julian to clarify previous statements. To confirm dates. To reconcile discrepancies. Julian answered, but his confidence had thinned. His explanations grew longer, more technical, less convincing. People become verbose when they're losing control. The mediator noticed. So, she said, there appears to be a pattern of financial movement coinciding with personal transitions. Julian stiffened. Correlation isn't causation. No, she replied. But it is relevant. Relevant. Another word that had changed sides. After the session, Julian didn't look at me. He gathered his things quickly and left without speaking. That night, he didn't come home. When he finally reached out 2 days later, the message was short. We need to resolve this. Resolve. Not clarify. Not understand. Resolve suggested closure without examination. I replied. Resolution follows process. He didn't answer. Martha called later that evening. He's losing leverage, she said. How much? I asked. Enough to notice, she replied. Not enough to panic yet. Panic would come later. Julian wasn't there yet. The real moment came quietly. A bank flagged a transaction. Not a freeze. A question. Routine compliance. Julian called me immediately. They're asking about a transfer, he said. This is unnecessary. Then answer them, I replied. They're copying your attorney, he added. That detail landed heavily. This is escalating, he said. No, I replied. This is surfacing. Julian tried to regain control the only way he knew how. By making it personal. I never wanted this to turn into a battle, he said when we finally spoke face to face again. This isn't a battle, I replied. It's accounting. He laughed bitterly. You're hiding behind process. No, I said. You're running from it. The words hung between us. Marissa messaged me again later that week. I think he's panicking. I read the message twice. Why do you think that? I asked. He keeps changing his story, she replied. About money. About timing. About you. That told me everything. Julian's narrative no longer held shape. It bent under scrutiny. And bending leads to breaking. By Friday, Julian's attorney requested a private call with Martha. Not hostile. Concerned. That distinction mattered. Julian wasn't being attacked. He was being assessed. An assessment is dangerous for people who rely on ambiguity. That night, Julian sent me one final message. I didn't think it would cost this much. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I replied with the truth he hadn't considered. Containment always does. What Julian never understood was this. You can't quietly step away from a life you built on shared structures without accounting for the weight of those structures. They don't collapse. They respond. By the end of the week, Julian wasn't trying to control the ending anymore. He was trying to limit exposure. And exposure, once it begins, doesn't need drama. It only needs light. When she stepped out of the frame, Marissa didn't leave with drama. That was the first thing Julian misunderstood. He had always assumed that if she ever walked away, it would be emotional. Loud. Tearful. Something he could frame as volatility or misunderstanding. He hadn't prepared for quiet resolve. And quiet resolve is the hardest thing to negotiate with. She stopped answering his calls first. Not all at once. Just selectively. The ones late at night. The ones framed as urgency without explanation. The ones where he expected reassurance more than conversation. Julian noticed immediately. He always noticed shifts in availability. He relied on access the way other people relied on trust. He sent messages instead. Can we talk? I just want to clear the air. This isn't what it looks like. None of them landed. Marissa read them. She just didn't respond. Julian mentioned it to me indirectly. She's pulling away, he said one evening, pacing the living room like he used to when strategizing aloud. I don't know why she's suddenly being distant. Suddenly. That word again. Nothing had been sudden. I think she's thinking, I replied. Julian frowned. About what? About where she stands, I said. And where she doesn't. He scoffed. She knows where she stands. Did you ever say it clearly? I asked. He didn't answer. The truth was, Marissa had begun asking questions Julian couldn't answer cleanly. Not emotional questions. Structural ones. What happens next? When? Under what conditions? Who knows what? Questions that required consistency. Questions that made it harder to improvise. Julian had always thrived on improvisation. It was accountability he struggled with. Marissa reached out to me 2 days later. Not defensively. Not cautiously. Directly. I don't think I want to continue this, she wrote. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then replied. You don't need my permission. Her response came quickly. I know. I just wanted you to know. That mattered. Not because it was considerate. Because it was final. Julian didn't take it well. He didn't lash out. He tried to reason. He left voicemails explaining timelines that no longer made sense. He sent messages reframing events as misunderstandings, stress responses, temporary complications. Marissa didn't argue. She disengaged. Disengagement isn't dramatic. It's decisive. Julian called me that night. She's overreacting, he said. I don't think she is, I replied. You've turned her against me. No, I said calmly. You lost her confidence. There was a long silence on the line. That's not fair, he said finally. I know, I replied. Fairness hasn't been part of this for a while. He hung up. The next morning, Julian's attorney requested an update. Not from him. From Martha. That detail told me everything. Julian's representation had begun adjusting to reality. Marissa's exit had consequences Julian hadn't anticipated. Not emotional ones. Structural ones. She had been part of his containment strategy. The quiet reassurance that he wasn't alone. The proof, to himself, that the transition was justified. The future he pointed toward when the present felt unstable. Without her, the story collapsed inward. Julian no longer had a destination. Only exposure. That week, Julian tried to reconnect. Not romantically. Narratively. He brought up old memories. Shared jokes. Future hypotheticals. "We could have handled this differently," he said one evening. Together. Together. The word felt misplaced now. "We did handle it together," I replied. "Just not the way you planned." The mediation resumed. This time, Julian spoke less. Listened more. His attorney asked clarifying questions on his behalf. He nodded rather than explained. The mediator noted the change. "Mr. Hale," she said, "you seem less certain about next steps." Julian swallowed. "Things have changed." Yes. They had. After the session, Julian finally admitted something aloud. Not to me. To himself. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," he said quietly, staring at the table. That was the first honest sentence he'd spoken in weeks. I didn't respond. Not because I lacked empathy. Because this wasn't a moment for reassurance. This was a moment for reckoning. Marissa sent one final message later that evening. "I told him I'm done." I replied. "I hope you find peace." She responded. "I hope you do too." That exchange closed a chapter. Not dramatically. Completely. Julian's behavior shifted after that. He stopped trying to control conversations and started avoiding them. He delayed decisions. Asked for extensions. Requested pauses. The man who once rushed to finalize now struggled to move at all. Momentum had reversed. He confronted me one last time. "I didn't think I'd end up alone," he said. I met his eyes. "You weren't alone," I replied. "You just treated people like placeholders." The words landed heavily. Because they were true. What Julian never understood was this. People will tolerate uncertainty. They will tolerate delay. They will even tolerate discomfort. But they will not tolerate being reduced to an accessory in someone else's story. Marissa had realized that. So had I. By the end of the week, Julian was no longer the center of anything. Not my decisions. Not Marissa's future. Not the process unfolding around him. He was a participant now. One of many. And for the first time, he understood what that meant. Isolation doesn't arrive the way people expect. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with slammed doors or unanswered calls. It slips in quietly, through the absence of reinforcement, the subtle realization that fewer people are reacting, fewer people are adjusting themselves around you. Julian felt it before he understood it. That was always his pattern. He woke up alone for the third morning in a row and didn't immediately reach for his phone. That, in itself, was new. For years, his mornings had begun with messages, confirmations, updates, reminders that his presence mattered somewhere. Even during the separation, there had been motion. Conversations. Reactions. Now, there was stillness. Not peace. Stillness. He went through his routine anyway. Shower. Coffee. Suit jacket carefully chosen, even though he no longer needed to impress anyone in particular. Old habits die slowly. When he stepped into the elevator of his building, he nodded at the concierge. The man nodded back, polite but reserved. Julian noticed. He'd always noticed. The nod used to come with recognition, with familiarity. Now it was simply professional. At work, Julian found himself waiting. Not for meetings. For responses. Emails that once received replies within minutes now lingered. Requests were acknowledged but not prioritized. Conversations ended sooner than he expected. No one was rude. That was the problem. Rudeness can be confronted. Politeness can't. He tried to reassert presence the way he always had, by being useful. He offered to lead a project. He volunteered insight during a meeting. He spoke with confidence, referencing experience that had once been unquestioned. People listened. Then they moved on. No follow-up questions. No invitations to expand. Julian sat back, unsettled. He had spoken. Why hadn't it landed? That evening, he called someone he hadn't spoken to in weeks. A colleague. A friend, once. Just checking in, Julian said. Of course, the man replied. Everything okay? The question sounded sincere. But it was followed by silence. Julian realized, suddenly, that he was expected to explain himself. I'm fine, he said. That's good, the man replied. Glad to hear it. And then the call ended. No next step. No continuation. Julian stared at his phone, confused. Isolation doesn't mean being ignored. It means being acknowledged without being engaged. That distinction hollowed him out slowly. Julian tried to talk to me again. Not about logistics. About meaning. This isn't what I thought it would be, he said one evening when we crossed paths briefly in the apartment. What did you think it would be? I asked. He hesitated. Cleaner, he said. Cleaner again. The word followed him like a ghost. What's unclean about it? I asked. He didn't answer. Because the mess wasn't external. It was internal. He sat down heavily at the table. I don't recognize my life, he said. I do, I replied. That startled him. You do? Yes, I said. You just didn't expect to be in it this way. Julian frowned. That's not fair. No, I agreed. It's accurate. Accuracy had replaced fairness. He stood shortly after, unable to stay still. Marissa hadn't contacted him again. That fact gnawed at him more than he admitted. Not because he missed her. Because her absence confirmed something he didn't want to face. She had left without needing closure from him. She had made a decision without consulting him. Julian had never been comfortable with that. He checked his phone at night anyway. Out of habit. Out of hope. Nothing came. The mediation slowed further. Documents reviewed. Questions answered. Delays granted. Julian found himself reacting instead of directing. He hated that feeling. He tried to regain footing by being accommodating. Whatever makes this easier, he said more than once. But accommodation without credibility doesn't restore trust. It only confirms imbalance. Martha updated me regularly. He's exhausted, she said during one call. Not angry. Not combative. Just worn. That didn't surprise me. Control is energizing. Loss of control is draining. Julian had spent years maintaining narratives. Adjusting tone. Anticipating reaction. Now, he was forced to wait. Waiting stripped him of identity. One afternoon, he asked me something I hadn't expected. Do you think people see me differently now? He asked. Yes, I replied. How? He pressed. As someone they no longer need to accommodate, I said. That hurt more than anger would have. He nodded slowly. Julian's reputation hadn't collapsed. It had thinned. People didn't speak badly of him. They spoke less. That kind of absence changes everything. At work, he was removed from a long-term initiative. Not publicly. Quietly. Reassigned. No explanation beyond strategic realignment. Julian read the message 3 times. He wasn't being punished. He was being deprioritized. That night, he poured himself a drink and didn't finish it. He sat in the dark, staring at nothing in particular. This wasn't failure. It was erosion. He tried to talk to me again before bed. I don't know who I am without all of this, he said. I looked at him for a long moment. You're still who you've always been, I replied. You just don't have an audience right now. The truth landed quietly. He nodded once. Julian didn't argue anymore. He didn't posture. He simply existed in the space between outcomes. That space is unbearable for people who live by momentum. The week ended without incident. No revelations. No reversals. Just continuation. And continuation, when stripped of validation, becomes reckoning. What Julian didn't understand yet was this. Isolation isn't the punishment. It's the environment where understanding finally has room to form. Whether he would use that room or retreat from it remained to be seen. Julian had always believed that if you changed the framing, you changed the outcome. New language. New posture. New audience. It was a strategy that had worked for him before, professionally, socially, even personally. So when isolation stopped feeling temporary and began to feel structural, reinvention became his next move. Not as desperation. As design. It began quietly. Julian updated his routines first. Earlier mornings. Longer workouts. A new suit that signaled restraint rather than authority. He spoke less about what had happened and more about what was coming next. I'm focusing on clarity, he said to anyone who would listen. Clarity was the word he reached for now, cleaner than explanation, safer than truth. At work, he adjusted his tone. He listened more. Asked questions he once would have answered himself. He positioned his distance as intentional, his silence as thoughtful. People noticed. They didn't respond the way he expected. They acknowledged it politely and moved on. Reinvention only works when people are willing to forget who you were. They weren't. Julian tried again socially. He accepted invitations he'd once declined. Stayed longer at gatherings. Laughed at stories he didn't find funny. Presented himself as reflective, evolved, past the conflict. I learned a lot, he said once, raising his glass. Transitions have a way of doing that. The word transition followed him everywhere, as if repetition could turn it into truth. People smiled. They didn't ask questions. That silence unsettled him more than confrontation ever could. He reached out to me again during this phase. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. To reconnect. I think we've both changed, he said one evening when we crossed paths briefly. Maybe more than we realize. I looked at him carefully. He did look different. Less sharp. Less certain. Softer around the edges. What are you hoping for? I asked. He hesitated. Understanding, he said. Perspective. He wanted absolution disguised as insight. I understand, I replied. I'm just not involved anymore. The distinction landed heavily. Julian's reinvention stalled when it met resistance he couldn't identify. Nothing overt. No rejection. Just lack of uptake. He wasn't being opposed. He was being excluded. Not maliciously. Practically. At mediation, his tone had shifted completely. He was agreeable now. Flexible. Open to alternatives he would have dismissed weeks earlier. I'm willing to compromise, he said. The mediator nodded. Martha made notes. Compromise, this late, wasn't leverage. It was concession. That afternoon, Julian did something unexpected. He apologized. Not fully. Not clearly. But audibly. I handled some things poorly, he said, eyes lowered. I see that now. It was the first time he hadn't qualified the statement. No but. No explanation. Just the admission. It should have felt satisfying. It didn't. Because it wasn't aimed at repair. It was aimed at relief. Marissa remained absent. That absence had become permanent. Julian didn't mention her anymore. Not to me. Not in mediation. Not even indirectly. It was as if removing her from the narrative would erase the consequence of losing her. But absence doesn't erase. It clarifies. Julian's reinvention attempt reached its peak one evening when he invited me to dinner. Not romantic. Not nostalgic. Intentional. I think we should talk, he said. As people who shared something meaningful. I considered it. Then agreed. Not because I needed the conversation. Because I wanted to observe it. The restaurant was quiet. Neutral. Carefully chosen. Julian spoke about growth. About lessons. About moving forward with integrity. He spoke about himself as if he were already past this moment. I don't regret everything, he said. But I do regret how I handle parts of it. Parts. Always parts. And what are you hoping happens now? I asked. He paused. I want us to end this without bitterness, he said. I want mutual respect. Respect again. I nodded. And if that doesn't happen? He frowned. Why wouldn't it? Because respect isn't negotiated, I said. It's reflected. The conversation ended shortly after. Not badly. Not well. Just conclusively. That night, Julian returned to an apartment that no longer felt temporary. It felt transitional in the wrong direction. He had changed everything he could. Except the one thing reinvention couldn't fix. Trust. Julian would realize soon enough that reinvention isn't the same as redemption. Redemption requires accountability. Reinvention only requires effort. Effort alone doesn't convince anyone who's already seen behind the curtain. For me, something shifted after that dinner. Not resolve. Release. I stopped tracking Julian's movements as closely. Stopped reviewing updates with the same intensity. Not because the process was finished. Because my role in it was changing. Watching had served its purpose. Now, distance would do the rest. Julian believed reinvention was his next chapter. He didn't realize it was his last attempt to remain relevant in a story that no longer centered him. Julian waited until he believed the timing was perfect. That was always his instinct, delay until momentum slowed, until attention drifted, until people were tired enough to accept resolution without scrutiny. He mistook exhaustion for forgiveness. He mistook silence for consent. He believed he still had one move left. The message arrived late on a Thursday afternoon. Not a call. Not a confrontation. An email. Formal. Polite. Carefully worded. Julian's attorney proposed an accelerated settlement framework, efficient, mutually beneficial, designed to bring closure. The language was neutral enough to appear generous, but specific enough to reveal intent. There it was. The last leverage. Julian framed it as relief. This could end everything, he said when we spoke briefly that evening. No more delays. No more tension. End everything. He meant the process. I meant the influence. What's changed? I asked. He hesitated. I just think it's time. Time again. Julian had used time the way other people used money, spending it, withholding it, leveraging it. Now he was running out. Martha reviewed the proposal carefully. Then she closed the folder. This is his exit, she said. Not yours. What does he gain? I asked. Containment, she replied. He limits disclosure. Avoids deeper review. Locks in narrative. And what do I lose? She looked at me. Optionality. That was the question, then. Not money. Not pride. Choice. Julian's proposal wasn't unreasonable on the surface. That was the danger of it. It offered speed. Certainty. A clean line forward. It would spare him further scrutiny and spare me additional waiting. It would also freeze the story where he wanted it to stop. Before clarity fully settled. Before accountability finished forming. Julian called me that night. I think this is best for both of us, he said. For you, I replied. For us, he insisted. We don't need to keep reopening wounds. This isn't a wound, I said. It's a structure. He sighed. You're holding on to this longer than necessary. No, I replied. You are. Silence stretched between us. I just want my life back, he said quietly. That was the truth. But not the whole one. Julian wanted his life back without integrating what he'd done to get here. He wanted to move forward without carrying consequence. That was the leverage he believed still existed. Marissa messaged me that same night. Not about him. About herself. I've been thinking about how easily I accepted uncertainty, she wrote. That scares me. I read it carefully. Then replied. Awareness is progress. She responded a few minutes later. I don't think he ever planned to choose. He planned to manage. That sentence landed hard. Because it was precise. Julian followed up the next morning. My attorney needs an answer soon, he said. Why? I asked. So we can move on. Move on again. Always forward. Never through. I'll let you know, I replied. He didn't like that. I spent the afternoon walking. Not pacing. Walking. I let the city move around me while I stayed present. The question wasn't should I accept. The question was what do I want the ending to reflect? Control? Justice? Peace? Or something quieter? Julian believed leverage meant pressure. He didn't understand that leverage dissolves the moment you stop needing outcome. And I had reached that point. When I met with Martha again, I already knew my answer. I'm not countering, I said. She raised an eyebrow. You're declining? I'm not engaging, I replied. Let the process continue. She smiled faintly. That's the strongest position. Julian's leverage depended on urgency. Removing urgency removed the move. I called Julian that evening. Not to argue. Not to negotiate. I'm not accepting the accelerated settlement, I said. There it was. Silence on the line. Why? He asked finally. Because it serves your timeline, I replied. Not mine. This could drag on, he said. Yes, I replied. It could. You're choosing delay, he said. No, I replied. I'm choosing distance. That distinction mattered. Julian's voice hardened. So that's it? He asked. You're just going to let this keep unfolding? Yes, I said calmly. I am. You're punishing me, he said. No, I replied. I'm releasing you from relevance. The words ended the conversation. Julian didn't call again that night. Or the next. The leverage had failed. Not because it was weak. Because it required my participation. And I had withdrawn it. By the end of the week, the proposal quietly expired. No escalation. No confrontation. Just absence. That absence did more damage to Julian's confidence than any rejection could have. Because it confirmed what he had been avoiding. He no longer dictated pace. The last leverage had been offered. It had been declined. Not emotionally. Structurally. And with that decision, the ending stopped being negotiable. The irreversible moment didn't arrive with force. There was no announcement. No decisive meeting. No sentence spoken aloud that changed everything. It arrived the way finality often does, through stillness. Julian noticed it first in the absence of response. The proposal had expired quietly. No counter. No rejection letter. No dramatic refusal. Just silence, followed by continuation. The process moved forward as it had before, unhurried and methodical. That silence told him something he didn't want to believe. The story was no longer interactive. He tried once more to engage it. A message to his attorney. A follow-up question. A suggestion framed as cooperation. The responses came back neutral. Procedural. Correct. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was accelerated. Nothing was adjusted for him. That was when it landed. Julian sat alone in his apartment one evening, staring at the screen of his laptop without reading what was in front of him. This was different from isolation. Isolation still contains hope, hope that attention might return, that relevance might be restored. This was inertia. The machinery had continued without him. He thought about calling me. He didn't. He already knew the answer. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't reassure. I wouldn't negotiate. And worse, I wouldn't react. The final disclosures came in a thick, unremarkable email. No accusations. No conclusions. Just confirmation. Dates aligned. Transfers documented. Statements reconciled. Everything Julian had once believed he could manage with timing was now fixed in record. Record doesn't judge. It simply remains. At mediation, the atmosphere was almost subdued. Not tense. Resolved. The mediator outlined next steps with calm clarity. The timeline was no longer flexible. The scope was no longer theoretical. Julian listened. Nodded. Asked no questions. This was the moment he understood that participation had replaced influence. Afterward, he stood by the elevator with his attorney. I didn't think it would end like this, he said quietly. It isn't ending, his attorney replied. It's concluding. That distinction mattered. Julian tried one last time, not for leverage, but for meaning. He called me late that night. I think I finally understand what you were doing, he said. What do you understand? I asked. You weren't trying to win, he said. You were waiting. Yes, I replied. Waiting for what? For the moment when nothing needed to be said. Silence filled the line. That's now, he said. Yes, I replied. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for reconciliation. He asked something smaller. Do you hate me? No, I said honestly. I see you. That answer ended the conversation. Because hatred keeps people connected. Seeing them ends the attachment. The paperwork finalized in stages. Not all at once. Not ceremonially. Each confirmation arrived quietly, one after another, until there was nothing left to review. No choices left to make. Only acceptance. Julian walked through the apartment one last time. Not to remember. To inventory. What he would take. What he would leave. What no longer mattered. He didn't linger. Lingering suggests hope. When he closed the door behind him, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like resolution without relief. Relief comes later. For me, the irreversible moment had passed long before. But this was the point where the world caught up. Where everything aligned. Where the story no longer required continuation to prove itself. Julian believed endings were chosen. He learned instead that endings are recognized. You don't decide them. You arrive at them. The process moved on. So did I. And Julian, whether he realized it or not, had reached the one place he couldn't maneuver around. Finality. After the irreversible moment, nothing dramatic happened. That was the strange part. No emotional whiplash. No sudden clarity that felt cinematic. No collapse or rebirth that announced itself as such. Life simply continued. And in that continuation, the difference became obvious. Julian tried to resume a version of normal. He moved into a smaller apartment, temporary, he told himself, though the boxes stayed unpacked longer than he expected. The furniture was functional. The walls undecorated. He told people he liked the simplicity. He didn't. Simplicity without purpose feels like absence. He went back to work full-time. Not as a return. As a placement. His role remained intact, but diminished in ways no one needed to explain. He was still invited to meetings, but not the ones where decisions were shaped. Still copied on emails, but rarely asked to respond. Julian told himself it was temporary. Transitions take time. That phrase had become a reflex. People treated him kindly. That was worse. Kindness without reliance is unmistakable. It communicates that you are no longer central, no longer necessary to the outcome. Julian felt it most acutely in conversation. How are you? People asked. Fine, he replied. They nodded. And moved on. No follow-up questions. No curiosity. That was the change. Meanwhile, my life expanded in ways so subtle I barely noticed at first. Mornings felt quieter, not emptier, quieter. My thoughts moved without interruption. I stopped anticipating messages that never came. I stopped organizing my time around reactions that were no longer mine to manage. The process continued without my constant attention. I no longer tracked it. That was the real shift. The first time I realized Julian hadn't crossed my mind for an entire day, it startled me. Not because I missed him. Because the absence felt natural. Marissa didn't reappear. That, too, mattered. No messages. No updates. No orbit. She had exited the story entirely. And the story hadn't chased her. Julian, on the other hand, kept circling what had already ended. He revisited conversations in his head. Replayed moments where he believed a different word or pause might have changed the outcome. He didn't understand yet that outcomes don't hinge on moments. They hinge on patterns. And patterns don't respond to revision. He reached out once more. Not urgently. Tentatively. I hope you're doing well, he wrote. I read the message without tension. Then replied. I am. That was all. He didn't respond. The final paperwork arrived one afternoon while I was reorganizing a shelf. I signed it without ceremony. No rush. No hesitation. Just completion. When I placed the document back into the folder, I realized something important. I didn't feel lighter. I felt aligned. Julian felt the opposite. Completion left him exposed. Without process to manage, without narrative to adjust, he was left with himself, unmediated, unframed. People don't prepare for that. At a gathering weeks later, someone mentioned Julian casually. He's doing okay, they said, unsure. I nodded. The conversation moved on. No one asked for detail. That was the last time his name appeared in my presence without invitation. Julian noticed that too, eventually. The way doors didn't close on him, but didn't open either. The way conversations plateaued. The way people smiled without leaning in. This wasn't rejection. This was reclassification. I, on the other hand, began to feel something unfamiliar. Space. Not empty space. Unclaimed space. The kind that allows for choice. I changed small things first. My schedule. My routines. The places I frequented. Not to escape memory. To invite possibility. Julian tried to do the same. He joined a gym. Attended events. Spoke about new directions. But reinvention without reckoning rings hollow. People sense it instinctively. They don't oppose it. They ignore it. The contrast sharpened over time. I moved forward without effort. Julian strained to appear stationary. Movement, it turns out, doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself through ease. One evening, months later, I realized something else. I no longer needed an ending. The story had already released me. Julian would eventually adjust. Not transform. Adjust. He would learn to live with diminished relevance, quieter rooms, fewer invitations. Not because he was punished. Because he had exhausted the version of himself that required management. The aftermath wasn't about justice. It was about orientation. Who kept moving? Who stayed tethered? I closed the folder that evening and placed it somewhere out of sight. Not because it mattered less. Because it no longer mattered at all.